Well, that's the Sunday papers. Now we'll go straight to our program guest, and this week it's the Minister for Finance, Mathias Cormann, who joins us in the early hours from our studio in Perth. Good morning, welcome.
Good morning, good to be here.
Now, you seem to be saying two things at the moment, that there remains a budget emergency, but you're in no hurry to fix it. Now, that does seem to be a contradictory position.
Well, we inherited a budget emergency from the previous Labor government, and we are working in an orderly and methodical fashion through the usual processes of Parliament to fix it. Labor left behind $123 billion in projected deficits in their last budget, on top of $191 billion in cumulative deficits in their first 5 budgets, and they left behind a spending growth trajectory which, if unaddressed, would take us to $667 billion of debt and growing beyond within the decade. Now, the budget is our plan to repair the budget, and of course, if all of the measures in our budget are adopted, we will be able to reduce debt within the decade by nearly $300 billion down to $389 billion, and that is even taking into account the requirement for us to make some adjustments along the way for the effects of bracket creep.
Yeah, but you made the argument there that you can describe this as an emergency, but why no rush? And you've used those words yourself. There is no rush.
Well, what I've said is that there is no rush to deal with specific structural reforms which do not take effect until 1 July 2015, early 2016, or indeed not until 2017. I mean, it has always been thus that in relation to structural medium to long-term reforms, you obviously deal with them sequentially and in a prioritised fashion in the Senate. The Senate never ever has dealt with every bit of budget legislation on day one. Indeed, I mean, by the time we went to the last election, Labor still had not initiated legislation in relation to budget measures 2 budgets ago. I mean, as far as we're concerned, we are dealing with things as quickly as we sensibly can, bearing in mind that we had until 30 June a Senate that was controlled by Labor and the Greens, with Labor and the Greens both playing politics. Labor is opposing savings, $5 billion in savings that were initiated by Labor in government. Bill Shorten is now opposing them. The Greens are telling us that they are in favour of regular reductions in the excise on fuel. So that was the Senate we had to deal with till 30 June. We've had 2 weeks of the new Senate so far. The first 2 weeks were always going to be dominated by the carbon tax repeal, which is now gone as promised, and the mining tax repeal, which is still work in progress. So the point we're making is the budget situation we inherited is very serious. The spending and debt growth trajectory that we inherited is very serious and needs to be addressed. We're focused on repairing the budget as we promised, but we're doing it in an orderly, methodical fashion as we must.
You insist it's orderly.
Absolutely. I mean, look, obviously, as you work through the implementation of the budget, inevitably there's going to be a lot of noise. Inevitably, there is going to be a level of conversation seeking to scrutinise the decisions the government has made and why, and that is appropriate. But from our point of view, at the end of the day, what are we focused on? We delivered a budget. We are now working through the usual parliamentary process to implement the budget measures that we think are necessary in order to protect our living standards, in order to build opportunity and prosperity for the future.
Now,
and what I would...
The Prime Minister uses the fireman analogy, that when there's an emergency, the firemen turn up and from that moment on you start to get it under control. But that's not what's happening, is it? In fact, the fire's spreading.
Well, that is not true. I mean, we have started to get it under control, and as the Prime Minister, myself and others, Joe Hockey and others have said for some time now, I mean, a lot of the budget already, a lot of our budget, a lot of our plan to fix Labor's budget mess has already gone through.
But
for example,
if the fire is the deficit is spreading, the fire is still spreading, and then when the firemen turned up, you threw fuel on the fire by giving the Reserve Bank $9 billion.
Well, which was a very important, I mean, the Labor Party, in their desperation for more cash all the time, which they then wasted, along the way, completely depleted the capital reserves of the Reserve Bank, which was putting, Australia under, in a difficult situation. So the position here is this: if we don't take corrective action, we are on track for government debt to increase to $667 billion within the decade and grow going beyond that. We say that is not sustainable. We say that taking spending as a share of GDP to 26.5% by 23-24, which is the trajectory that Labor put Australia on, is not sustainable. Look at the revenue that is raised as a share of GDP. Tax revenue as a share of GDP over the past 20 years has averaged at 22.4%. So there's a significant fiscal gap between revenue and expenditure. If we leave that gap in place, we'll continue to increase the level of debt, which means we'll have to continue to increase the level of interest, which means that we continue to borrow from our children and grandchildren, forcing taxes up for them or imposing deeper cuts on them to pay for our lifestyle today. And we don't think that's fair.
If we can stretch the analogy again, the fireman thing, and it is an easy thing for people to understand that you turn up and you start to put out the fire, can you give the undertaking now that the budget deficit at the end of your first term will be smaller than it was at the time of the last election?
Well, if the budget is implemented, that will absolutely be the case. I mean, we inherited $123 billion worth of projected deficits in our last budget, and we've brought that down to about $60 billion in projected deficits over our budget. And of course, if you look at the trajectory over the forward estimates, we are on a believable path back to surplus, and that is working on the basis of more realistic assumptions than the Labor Party did. You've got to remember, I mean, Labor in May last year delivered a budget which within 11 weeks deteriorated by another $33 billion. And that was the story under Labor. They kept overestimating their revenue and underestimating their expenditure. And budget outcomes were always worse.
You're talking a lot about Labor, but the fact is you have made budget repair a key factor in what you plan to do. And yet, when I ask you whether you can reduce, not wipe out the deficit and produce a surplus, but can you reduce the budget deficit in 3 years? And your answer is maybe, if.
No. The answer is that we've laid out our plan to put the budget back on a believable path to surplus. Where is Labor's plan? I mean, does Bill Shorten still believe in a surplus? And if he doesn't,
you're in government now.
Like
you're in government now. So what's your plan?
Indeed.
And can you guarantee you will reduce the surplus, reduce the deficit?
Well, what is our plan? Our plan is in the budget, Barrie. Like, we delivered a budget in May, which presents our plan to put the budget back on a believable path back to surplus, and we're now working in an orderly and methodical fashion to implement that plan through the Parliament. What I'm saying, though, is our plan is the only plan to fix Labor's budget mess that's on the table. Where is Bill Shorten's plan? I mean, Wayne Swan used to sell the virtues of budget surpluses. He never quite got there, but at least he seemed to believe in getting the budget back to surplus. We haven't heard much from Bill Shorten at all about needing to get the budget back into surplus. And if he thinks it needs to get back to surplus and he doesn't like our plan, what is his plan?
Yeah, we're not even talking about getting it back into surplus. We're talking about reducing the deficit from where it was at the last election. And so you're saying that it's possible, if you can't achieve a breakthrough with the crossbenchers and with Labor and the Greens, then you might not reduce it at all.
No, I mean, what we're saying is that the budget is our plan to take us back into surplus on a believable and credible trajectory. And of course, our budget is there for all to see, and we are working to implement our budget. And about half of all of our budget measures have gone through. And indeed, I mean, our biggest single saving, which is a reduction in the funding growth for foreign aid to the tune of $7.6 billion over the forward estimates, that went through as part of the appropriation bills. A whole range of other savings measures went through as part of the appropriation bills. The Senate passed the budget repair levy even after Bill Shorten suggested that Labor would never support it. They quietly voted for it in the Senate. So, I mean, let's just wait and see what happens with the remaining medium to long-term structural reforms, which come into effect progressively from 2015 onwards. We'll continue to work to repair the budget as we promised we would.
And when the Prime Minister says that if the budget if they're not allowed to implement the budget, then there's the prospect down the track of increased taxes and higher interest rates, a coalition government would never allow that to happen, would you?
Yeah, but I mean, this is a statement of fact, though. Like, I mean, we've laid out our plan to reduce the unsustainable spending growth trajectory that Labor left behind. If we were not able to reduce spending growth, and if we continue to stay on an unsustainable debt growth trajectory, obviously at some point that will have to be paid back. And I mean, essentially, if we stay on a spending growth trajectory that takes us to 26.5% as a share of GDP, when tax revenue on average over the last 20 years was 22.4% as a share of GDP, and you don't want to balance the books by reducing spending, then the only alternative to balance the books is to increase taxes. And again, I mean, what is Bill Shorten's plan? Is he planning to increase taxes in order to make up for Labor's unsustainable spending growth trajectory?
And just finally, Martin Parkinson, the Treasury Secretary, said you should have put the some tax issues in the mix this time around. We got it wrong was the headline in the Fin. Do you now regret that you didn't say more about potential tax reform down the track, and certainly tax reform that might impact on wealthier people?
Well, I don't agree with him that we got it wrong, and of course we are dealing with tax reform as we said we would in the lead up to the last election through the tax reform white paper. In the meantime, we are doing exactly what we said we would do before the election, and that is repeal the carbon tax. The carbon tax is gone. Repeal the mining tax. We are quietly hopeful that we'll be able to get rid of this bad tax soon, and of course we'll be reducing company tax by 1.5% from 1 July 2015.
Minister, thanks for your time this morning.
Always good to talk to you.